Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. I just wanted to do a video on a piece I did in today's paper, analysing the amount of injuries that Ange Postecoglou's team have suffered this season. Now, this is off the back of, well, we know about the injuries all season long, really, particularly in the last few months, but having sat in the press conference and asked questions in that press conference after the Aston Villa defeat and witnessed Ange's long rant is the right word, but almost speech about how he feels like any analysis of his side that discounts the significance of his crippling injury crisis, he believes to be skewed and agenda-driven and basically unfair. I thought I'd have a real look at the stats behind it, and along with a colleague of mine, we looked at all the injuries, all the absentees, all the players that have missed games this season for Tottenham compared to the other clubs in Europe, in England, competing in Europe, cumulatively across the season for illness and injury, not from being cup-tied, so Dane Scarlett, for example, the other day doesn't count, or suspension, purely from injury and illness. And it does seem to back up the point he is making. So having looked at it, cumulatively, there have been 213 absentees across Tottenham's 39 matches this season. Compare that to the next worst, I suppose, is Arsenal, who have only played 38 games, so one fewer, but they've had 169 absentees, so that's 44 difference. That is more than 25% more. And then after that, you've got Man City, 158 in 37 games. Man United one behind, 157 in 38 games. Liverpool, obviously, flying at the top of the league. I know they lost to Plymouth, but overall been imperious this season. And Ange specifically made this point when talking about Liverpool after, and I think before the hiding that his side got in the Carabao Cup semi-final, about how, you know, they're a great team, but also they're the most sort of settled side and injury-free side of regarding big players. They've only had 100 games missed in 38 games, and I suppose someone like Federico Chiesa, who looks a bit of a bit part player there, is, you know, accounts for quite a lot of that. I'll come on to those specifics in a minute. Aston Villa 97 in 36, and Chelsea only 79 in 36 games. So, you know, compare 213 to 79, you know, between Tottenham and Chelsea. And I think it is fair to say he's got a point. I will come on to how I want to analyse this and sort of think ways you can push back, I suppose, against Ange's kind of argument that it's pretty much all down to injuries this season. I'll come on to that, but let's just stick with the stats at the moment. So since Rangers in the Europa League, which was December the 12th, Tottenham have never had fewer than 6 players out for each game. 6 players for injury or illness. Aston Villa on the weekend, where afterwards Ange obviously had this impassioned speech in the press conference, it was 11. 12 when you include Dane Scarlett, but for injury 11, which is what we're talking about here, and that's the 5th time they've been more than double figures, and that's mainly in the last month or two, really, it's been double figures. And then, like I said, with Chiesa example, when you look at the other teams, yes, they've had some big players missing. I mean, obviously Man City, Rodri is the biggest miss of any team this season, undoubtedly. But Arsenal, I mentioned, was second on the list with 169. 55 of those are accounted for by Kieran Tierney and Takahiro Tomiyasu, both very good players. And to be fair, if Tomiyasu was fit, maybe you could make the case that he might be pushing for a starting spot, but probably not. He's probably more backup now that Timber's come back. And Tierney, let's be honest, I think he's widely reported to go to Celtic. He's been very much a bit part player for Arteta, at best. Whereas you compare that to Spurs, and out of their 213, 52 of them are accounted for of Van de Ven and Romero. So it's not only this, you know, quantity, it's almost the quality of players that they've missed, Spurs, this season. So ultimately, when you look at these numbers, I think it would be deeply unfair, as I've said consistently throughout all these post-match reviews of games, to remove the significant factor in all of it about the injuries having such an influence on performances and results. You can't do it without that. It's just not fair. And Ange has made that point, reiterated it quite a lot, but particularly after Aston Villa. Where I sit, I suppose, on this is, like I say, I agree with his point overall. It's just whether, and I kind of made this point in the post-match video after Aston Villa, which one, I forget who commented. I got a lot of comments on that video. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff to be talked about with Tottenham. One comment which really made me laugh was that it basically looked like I was about to do the Bohemian Rhapsody song, because it was I was in my car, it was very dark, and that made me laugh. So whoever you are who wrote that, just know that made me laugh. But if you haven't seen it, go and check it out. Maybe have it on, don't have to watch it, just have it on the audio in the background, which I know a lot of you guys do generally. But within that, I did make the point about injuries, but whether it's enough, basically, to excuse all of the terrible form, particularly in the league, and now going out the cups over the last few months. And I suppose where I sit on this is there are definitely things you could look at as to how he could have maybe helped himself a bit more to have lessened the damage. And I think the ultimate example of that, and I do feel like captain hindsight with all of these things, what you could have done, and after the fact it's easy for everyone to say, but I do think one that really does stand out, and to be fair, a lot of fans were calling it for a long time, is the use of Jed Spence. Now Spence has become, if not indispensable, to use a bit of a cheesy pun, in the last few months, he's definitely become an integral figure. And now that Destiny Udogie is, I understand, back this weekend, there is a case to be said, maybe Spence keeps his place or shifts to the right. He's fought his way back into the reckoning and really contributed, and fair play to him. But it wasn't through design. Yes, Ange decided to keep him in the summer, so I suppose that he deserves credit on that front. And also, his performances, people might just say, as kind of the case I was about to make, that basically Ange has sort of lucked upon this with Spence. Well, who's to say that his whole motivational strategy of holding him back and then using the way he has not brought the best out of Jed Spence? Having said that, it does feel like he only really got his opportunity once the injury started to kick in. And one could make the case that he could have used him earlier, could have included him in his Europa League squad, for example. Not unsurprising to see him be brought back into the Europa League squad now for the knockouts. And not only would he have been a valuable player, I suppose, he also potentially could have lessened the risk to injury of someone like an Udogie had there been a bit more rest and rotation. And that's what a lot of fans have been making the point, saying there could have been more rest and rotation earlier in the season, and perhaps that would have contributed to it not being quite so damaging this season. The other point that people consistently make, and Ange consistently pushes back on, but it does seem strange when you consider the history at Celtic and other clubs, is the quantity of muscle injuries in the squad. I mean, you can go through the list of them, the amount of hamstrings and calf injuries. Now, people point to the fact that his intensity of his training and the matches are a contributing factor. It does seem strange that they do seem to have such a high proportion that I don't think you can discount that. But the only thing I would say on that note, which Ange has pointed out himself and actually said ahead of the Liverpool game, was that for the last 4 months, he said, the training has been so light that people like me could even get involved and it would be fine, because it's all been about recovery because of the relentlessness of the fixture schedule. Maybe you could argue the way they play, or in the lead up, I suppose, to this part of the season, perhaps the intensity of the training in the summer or whatever it might be a contributing factor. But I also should point out, and my friend Dan Kirkpatrick on our latest episode of the Tottenham Way podcast, which you should check out, I think, if you're interested, if you like these videos, you'll definitely like that podcast, made the point that none of us really know. We're just sort of speculating. We're looking at the data, I suppose, and looking at what's happened previously and just presuming it's the case. So that should be definitely mentioned. But I suppose I also feel like if you're having a big debate about injuries in Tottenham and the way that Ange is pinning it pretty much all on the injuries as the reason for the drop-off in form, I think it would be remiss to not even mention the suggestion that his approach maybe have affected the number of injuries. Anyway, so I wanted to cover that off. And then the other thing I think that needs to be mentioned is the midfield so far, particularly at Villa at the weekend, has been ripped apart at times. They've been too easy to play through. They really were against Villa. And the irony with that is, yes, James Maddison at the moment is injured, but generally the midfield's been the one that hasn't been as affected as the defence or the attack in terms of injuries. I suppose Bentancur had a 7-game suspension, so that didn't help. And there's a whole debate to be had about Bentancur's performances at the moment, given that you think he should be fresher than most players because of that suspension. And I felt like at Villa he was really, really poor and not good at Liverpool either. But ultimately it is the manager, how the midfield play, and the fact that they seem to be too easy to play through quite regularly, no matter who's in that team, is a concern. I don't think you can pin that one down to injuries. So that's almost not really relevant to this particular debate. But ultimately, like I was saying, where I sort of sit on all this is, yes, I can see those points, and I do think they have some validity. But ultimately, it comes back to the comment that Ange made a little while ago, where he said the analogy of the brightness of the sun. Basically, you can go outside, you can say, cool, it's bright outside. What is it? What can't be the sun? What is it? No, it's obviously the sun. And in this case, and I've come back to that a few times because I really like that analogy, but I do think it is relevant and completely on point with this particular issue, is yes, it is still the injuries. What you can basically argue is that he could have done certain things to have lessened how bad it's affected the league form in particular. But ultimately, any manager who has his starting goalkeeper, his starting centre-backs, his left-back, his main playmaker, his centre-forward, his biggest signing, the club's record signing, his wingers, his finisher on the right in Johnson, all these players who would be starting probably in their best 11 or not far off, and definitely a lot of them would be. Any manager who's missed all of those players would be affected and probably have their season decimated over the course of time. You might get through a few games, but with a relentless schedule like they've had, it would catch up. So I don't think really, whatever you say about Postecoglou and his tactics and his approach, and how maybe he could have helped himself with certain ways of going about it or adapting or whatever it might be, I think it wouldn't have been far off what's happened anyway because of the injuries. Maybe it wouldn't have been quite so bad. And that doesn't really sort of excuse, particularly against Liverpool, a perceived lack of fight in the team. That's a sort of different quality, although I suppose when you're really mentally fatigued, it is hard, and you're being, and you're playing a really good team under relentless pressure, it's just really hard, and it's probably easier to wilt in that regard, albeit that's not an excuse for any fan, to be honest, when they want to hear that, but I'm just sort of speaking how one can see that happening. But ultimately, I think any manager would have their season ruined basically by all these injuries. So ultimately, he has a point. And I think anyone who doesn't see it that way is being a bit unfair on him. That doesn't mean to say that you have to think he's the right man going forward. Whatever you feel about him tactically, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of a different debate to be had. I just think if you're not taking into account, as these numbers lay bare, then you're not really being fair to analysing him. Now, what's interesting, kind of onto that final point, is what's coming with the players coming back and hopefully staying fit, although you never can tell with Tottenham. But for example, like I said, I think Udogie's back this week. I've seen it reported that Vicario, Maddison, Johnson have got a good chance to be involved against Man United, and that would fit with the timeline that Ange has used of late. He said 7 to 10 days, about 10 days ago now. So hopefully those players are in a position to be involved. Maybe even Wilson Odobert. Then that's when he can truly be judged. Basically, that's when there is a big opportunity. There's no excuses in terms of players missing. And if he still can't turn it around, that's when I think if people have lost faith in him, that would be kind of fair enough. But who's to say he won't turn it around at this point? As Unai Emery said right at the end of his press conference when I asked him a question, he said he was pretty sure that the form would turn around when he gets his players back. And that would be the challenge to Postecoglou. But anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for this video. I'll do a video off the back of the press conference ahead of Man United. Take it easy, guys. Cheers.